Not here to introduce James Steenberg. Dr. James Steenberg, he's joined the department a few years ago, was focusing on the carbon file for quite a while. Now he's focusing on the SGEM file. And yeah, he's another generation from me.
Thanks, Peter. Multi-age forest, multi-age presenters here. Hi everyone, morning. Nice to be here. I'm a woodland owner as well, but it's only a few hundred square feet in the middle of Halifax. But I'll have you know that I've planted some long-lived, intermediate to tolerant species underneath an overstory of invasive Norway maple. So restoration can happen anywhere. Okay, how does this work?
Button to the right.
Right side.
Oh. It's going all over the place. There we go. Yeah, just this to say that this piece of the slideshow that I'm going to go over today around putting ecological forestry into practice is traveling roadshow with a few people from the forestry division, in addition to the ecosystems group. There's also my manager Sean Power and co-worker Jamie Ring, and they'll be presenting in other regions. Where should I be pointing?
Right side at the left.
Oh, okay. There you go. So let's talk about, after that great bit of context that Peter Neely gave us around ecology and natural disturbances in Nova Scotia, how do we implement that in silviculture and forestry on the ground? And what tools can we have in our back pocket to help us do that in the woodland context? So I think an important starting point here around ecological forestry in Nova Scotia, and very much rooted in, one of the flagship pieces of the Leahy Review is the triad model of forestry. And really that's a kind of zoning of the land base, of the working forest land base, where we want to have, it's like we talked about with the Leahy Review, and like what Andy was saying, it's about trade-offs between values here and improving and bolstering our biodiversity focus through ecological forestry, but also recognizing other trade-offs that we need to have, and minimizing impacts on the forests. And so the triad looks to do that by having a zone of conservation, hands off, and the sole purpose of this area is biodiversity. On the other end of the spectrum, a zone of high production forestry, which is about intensive silviculture and more of a timber focus first. And then, of course, the much larger ecological matrix. An ecological matrix here, this is where the ecological forestry is happening, on the ground, and this is what I'm going to focus on today, and the tools that are our hands in doing so. And just important to note that, this triad zone, and I think one of the experts engaged in the Leahy Review, Bob Seymour, a prof from Maine, I heard him say it on the CBC radio that everyone likes 2 of the 3 triad zones, and it's a challenge. But we know an important takeaway that the high production zone is certainly the smallest, and we know that it's in the name actually of the ecological matrix that these other zones are embedded in that ecological matrix. So it's the largest zone, and it's surrounding our conservation and our high production ones. So looking to that ecological matrix, let's talk about relatively hot, still off the press silvicultural guide for the ecological matrix. Some of you might be familiar with the forest management guide, which is a silvicultural guide that was updated and essentially replaced by the SGEM here in all the work that's happened since the Leahy Review. While I remember what I have to say, actually take a sip of coffee, because it makes me look like I know what I'm doing. So what this does, like I've been saying here, is we're implementing ecological forestry and emulating natural disturbances at the stand level. And that's often the hardest one, because this is where these real decisions in terms of what you're going to be cutting and your retention and how you're going to conserve biodiversity, this is where a lot of these are happening on the ground, but they also need to happen, and like Peter was saying, at multiple scales, at the planning stage, at the landscape level, even at the entire province level, with things like whether it's sustainable harvest levels or whether it's climate change. But the SGEM is really focusing on that stand level of implementing ecological forestry. And like we talked about, it's about emulating natural disturbances. And I'll go through some of the silvicultural treatments that are recommended and guided towards in this guide a bit later, and how they connect with those. And it's about a consistent ecosystem-based approach for Nova Scotia's forests. And when I say consistent, I don't mean one size fits all, of course. I mean consistent in the way that it's prioritizing biodiversity and bringing in ecological forestry across the province. And going forward, and this is being implemented as we speak on Crown land, and it'll be required. But certainly the hope and dream is this is a tool to be in the hands of private woodland owners as well. Whenever you put in these animations, you gotta click the button so many times, right? And it's all about creating and importantly restoring more complex resilient forests. So multiple age cohorts, species composition that reflect the ecology of the site, based on our forest ecosystem classification. And the way that it does that is, in addition to a few other, lots of other features that I'll talk about, is it has decision keys that are rooted in the ecosystem, so the forest group from our forest ecosystem classification, and they guide you towards what's going to be appropriate for this particular ecosystem that you happen to be in on your woodland. And as an example here, I won't walk through this. We don't have time today really to get in the weeds, but the weeds are good to get into, and we can do that at other dates. But it just requires that we assess in the field, the ecology and also the timber objectives of a given stand of forest, and we measure things, actual data collection, evidence-based, that we can use to put through these decision keys so that the silvicultural treatment will be appropriate for the ecosystem, based on all these decades of research that we have, and we're fortunate to have. So things like, of course, the forest ecosystem classification, like I mentioned, some of the timber objectives, like growing stock, but also acceptable growing stock. So is this tree here something that we expect to live for another 15 years plus? And is it something that could become a higher value timber product down the line, which I know is often an objective, to get those higher value products? And the goal for all these treatments is that the amount of that acceptable growing stock is increased every time that the stand is being managed. And some other key variables, species composition, especially those long-lived, tolerant Acadian species, which I'll talk about in a moment, natural regeneration, stand structure, and wind throw hazard. These are all considerations here. So this is a real big focal point of the SGEM, which is our long-lived, intermediate to tolerant species. And these are the ones that we expect to be finding in sort of late successional forests, and that's what we're trying to manage towards. They're longer lived, they're very shade tolerant, and then they very much affect the decision keys and the recommendation ultimately of which silviculture treatment you're going to be looking at. So we probably are familiar with all our Nova Scotia tree species and which ones are longer lived. There's ongoing research on white spruce and red maple, but these ones are, they can switch back and forth. White spruce is not really a long-lived species in old field settings or in the coast or the highlands as much. Red maple is really only a long-lived species in tolerant hardwood forests. And within these, we also have the long-lived, highly tolerant species. And these three here especially are characterized with old growth and late successional forest in the province. An important point here, and Peter highlighted this, is that most of Nova Scotia is the Acadian forest, and these Acadian ecosite group, as it's called in the classification guide. And this, the silvicultural guide, the SGEM, that's being implemented right now, it's for the Acadian forest, and there's still ongoing research going on to support the Maritime Boreal guide that will be, worked on continuously as we proceed from here. But it's not just about the silviculture in the guide now, and in implementing ecological forestry, of course, and there's other features there that are considered and have targets and prescriptions for Crown and would be good guidelines for private, for those looking for these tools that they can use to support what they want to do. And these include how to include biodiversity features, explicitly in the treatment. So things like a certain number of permanent reserve trees, which is a new term in the guide, per hectare. So these permanent reserve trees are things like super canopy trees, like a white pine, growing 5 meters above your canopy, cavity trees, trees that are rare for your stand or your site or your woodland, mast trees like red oak, and of course, across the board, increased levels of living retention. So the amount of basal area or trees that we're keeping on the woodland after these treatments is going to be higher across the board. But dead retention matters as well. So we're looking at retaining snags, so standing dead and down trees, coarse woody material, and of course protecting future cohorts of trees during the treatment. And these groupings of silvicultural treatments that you'll find in the SGEM, they kind of follow that spectrum of disturbance severity that Peter was talking about, from sort of low severity disturbances like gap dynamics in the single tree selection and group selection, silvicultural treatments that would be more appropriate ecologically for areas that have more severe and frequent disturbance regimes. So your overstory removal and your uniform shelter woods, for example, and of course some recommendations for tending, like pre-commercial thinning. But the new kid in town, and kind of the star of the show in the SGEM, is the irregular shelter wood. And so we're going to spotlight these a little bit. And these reflect, they're going to be pretty common. They might be one of the most applied treatments on crown, just based on our current forest conditions. And these emulate, for the most part, moderate to low disturbances. And there's a high and a medium retention version of these. So let's just go into them a bit more. So the irregular shelter wood, in a perfect world, we'd have decades of silvicultural research in the province demonstrating these things. But values change, times change, and with Leahy review, those have just started in the past few years, but we're monitoring them to understand. But there is a lot of good research that we've built on for this, in Maine, for example, and in Quebec. And what this silvicultural treatment wants to do is draw from the toolboxes of uneven age and even age silviculture, with the end of the day objective of increasing that stand complexity. So creating more age cohorts in the forest, directing your species composition towards those longer lived species, and of course in ours there's also increased retention, those biodiversity features as well. These are all part of the irregular shelter wood, and we have I guess you could say 4 versions in 2 different categories. The medium and high retention irregular shelter wood, you're going to retain more when you're in somewhere that has a lot more of those long-lived species, and it's in an ecosystem type that has less severe disturbance regimes. So you would retain 2/3 of the basal area, and then the more moderate disturbance areas, you'd go to a 50% retention. And the other piece that we consider here is the stand structure and how patchy it is and how vulnerable it is to wind disturbance. And for less vulnerable, more uniform stands, we'd look at a continuous cover, irregular shelter wood here. And for more wind exposed and vulnerable to wind throw forest or patchy forest as well, we'd look at a gap irregular shelter wood. And one of the key pieces of this silvicultural treatment, and as one of the figureheads for ecological forestry implementation, is that it's irregular, right? And so, for example, the trails aren't all just uniform stripes across the land base. They're irregular. They allow us to protect biodiversity features as we go through the stand, and to protect advanced regeneration, but also to reflect the ecology of the woodlands that you're in. Where if we're trying to for example, in a spruce hemlock forest where we have just a bunch of red spruce, a bunch of balsam fir, with balsam fir not being very long lived in this province, and it's in patches across the landscape, well, you're going to design this irregular shelter wood to remove those patches of balsam fir, promote red spruce and maybe eastern hemlock regeneration, and design it like that way, and have the irregularity that will allow you to do that. And so the differences between the SGEM and the Forest Management Guide, we can see them across the board. And just one example, and it's a prominent one here in our spruce hemlock forest group. We would look at in the past in the forest management guide. This type of forest with a moderate wind throw hazard, it might have been an overstory removal based on a number of things that I've listed here, but also that are in that guide that go in the decision keys. Whereas now we're going to move this to a higher retention treatment that focuses on, maintaining the forest sector, but also putting biodiversity first, like it says in Leahy, and it would be a medium retention gap irregular shelter wood. And that gap to acknowledge that there's a higher risk of wind throw if it were a continuous cover kind of treatment. So there's a lot to absorb there, but it's exciting times for forestry in Nova Scotia. So Peter and I'd love to take any questions, and thanks very much.